On February 2nd, 1685, the King of England collapsed mid-shave, and what his own doctors did to him over the next 4 days remains one of the most horrifying medical ordeals ever recorded. The men trying to save his life essentially tortured him to death. Charles II is remembered as the Merry Monarch, the fun-loving party king of England. But behind the famous smile was a traumatized survivor hiding secrets that could have cost him his crown and his head. His entire reign was a performance, and the truth only came out when he was dying. Charles was born on May 29, 1630, at St. James's Palace in London, the eldest surviving son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. On paper, it was the most privileged childhood in Europe. He was heir to 3 kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, raised in palaces surrounded by servants, spaniels, and gold. But that golden world had a rotten foundation. His father believed, with absolute conviction, that God had personally chosen him to rule, and that no parliament on earth had the right to question him. It was a belief that would destroy the family. In August 1642, when Charles was just 12 years old, that destruction arrived. The English Civil War broke out, king against Parliament, and the boy's education moved from classrooms to military camps. At 14, he was given nominal command of royalist forces in the West Country. At 15, he was fleeing his own country. And at 18, exiled in The Hague, he received the news that would define every single decision he made for the rest of his life. On January 30th, 1649, his father was marched onto a scaffold outside the banqueting house in London and publicly beheaded. A king, an anointed king, executed by his own subjects like a common criminal. Charles reportedly could not even speak when he was told. In a single stroke of the axe, he became a king, with no country, no army, no money, and a very clear understanding of exactly what the English people were capable of doing to a monarch they turned against. That lesson carved itself into him permanently. Charles would spend the next 36 years making absolutely certain that he never, ever ended up like his father, no matter what he had to hide, who he had to betray, or what he had to sign. But before he could protect the crown, he had to win it back. And that pursuit very nearly killed him. In 1651, the 21-year-old exile made his move. He landed in Scotland, raised an army, and invaded England, straight into disaster. On September 3, at the Battle of Worcester, Oliver Cromwell's forces crushed him completely. Around 3,000 of his men were killed and roughly 10,000 captured. Charles himself escaped the battlefield with a bounty of £1,000 on his head, a fortune, and a kingdom full of soldiers hunting him with orders that amounted to a death sentence. What followed were 6 of the most desperate weeks any English king ever lived through. Charles cut his famous long hair, stained his skin, and disguised himself as a servant and a woodcutter. He was 6'2", freakishly tall for the 17th century, which made him almost comically difficult to hide. On September 6, With parliamentarian patrols sweeping the woods around Boscobel House, the King of England climbed into the branches of a large oak tree and stayed there for roughly 14 hours while soldiers searched the ground directly beneath him. One sneeze, one snapped twig, and English history ends in that forest. He survived, barely, with the help of a network of loyal Catholic families who risked execution to move him from safe house to safe house. One of them was a quiet Catholic priest named Father John Huddleston, who sheltered the fugitive king and helped tend his wounded, bleeding feet. Charles never forgot the man. And 34 years later, Father Huddleston would be smuggled up a hidden staircase to perform one final service for him. One so explosive it had to be kept secret from almost everyone in the palace. Charles escaped to France in October 1651. And then came the years the palace historians prefer to skip, nearly a decade of humiliating, grinding poverty. The King of England wandered Europe borrowing money, wearing threadbare clothes and begging foreign courts for support that never came. He was, in modern terms, a homeless monarch living on loans, constantly watched, constantly paranoid that Cromwell's assassins were closing in. Some historians believe this decade broke something in him permanently. The charming smile everyone would later describe was less a personality and more a survival tool. Trust no one, promise everyone, commit to nothing. Then, in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died, and his republic died with him. Cromwell's son proved hopeless, the government collapsed into chaos, and a desperate England came crawling back to the only stable option left. On May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles rode into London through crowds so enormous and so drunk on celebration that observers said the road from Dover was lined for miles. The merry monarch was home. The theatres reopened. Christmas, banned under the Puritans, was legal again. England exhaled. But underneath the fireworks, the new king had scores to settle. And his revenge was anything but merry. On January 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of his father's execution, chosen deliberately, Charles ordered the body of Oliver Cromwell dug up from its tomb in Westminster Abbey. The corpse, dead over 2 years, was dragged to Tyburn, hanged in chains before a jeering crowd, and then decapitated. Cromwell's severed head was mounted on a 20-foot spike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for around 25 years, a constant, rotting reminder of what happened to men who killed kings. The regicides who were still alive fared worse. Those Charles could catch were hanged, drawn, and quartered. So much for the party king. This was the other Charles, the one the portraits never show. In May 1662, Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a devoutly Catholic Portuguese princess, whose staggering dowry included the ports of Tangier and Bombay, a wedding gift that would quietly help build the British Empire. Catherine, the long-suffering queen, arrived in England, speaking barely any English and genuinely hoping for a loving marriage. What she got instead was public humiliation on a scale that shocked even the jaded royal court. Charles insisted on appointing his mistress, Barbara Villiers, as a lady of the Queen's own bedchamber, forcing his wife to be waited on daily by the woman sharing her husband's bed. Catherine reportedly collapsed with a nosebleed when she was first presented with her. Barbara Villiers was the ruthless favorite, beautiful, volcanic, and terrifyingly ambitious. She bore Charles 5 children, wielded more political influence than most ministers, and treated the royal treasury like a personal shopping account, while the country drowned in debt. And she was only the beginning. Over his lifetime, Charles officially acknowledged 14 illegitimate children by 7 different mistresses. From duchesses to actresses to Nell Gwyn, an illiterate former orange seller from the London slum. Rumour claimed his lovers numbered in the hundreds. The true count will likely never be known. But those 14 acknowledged children hide the cruelest irony of his entire reign, one that would ultimately doom his dynasty. Because the one woman who could give him a legal heir couldn't, Catherine, suffered at least 3 miscarriages and never carried a child to term. The most spectacularly fertile king in English memory was legally childless. He was father to a dozen dukes, but a king without an heir. And while the court partied, the country began to burn, almost literally. In 1665, the Great Plague tore through London, killing an estimated 100,000 people, close to a quarter of the city's population. Bodies piled in the streets. Entire households were nailed shut inside their own homes with red crosses painted on the doors. And the king's response? He packed up the court and fled to Oxford, leaving the capital's poor to die in numbers so vast the death carts couldn't keep pace. Not exactly the finest hour for a man whose entire brand was loving his people. Then, before London could even bury its dead, it caught fire. On September 2nd, 1666, a blaze that started in a bakery on Pudding Lane exploded into a firestorm that raged for 4 days, destroying roughly 13,200 houses and 87 parish churches, and leaving up to 100,000 people homeless. To his genuine credit. And this is one of the few unambiguously heroic moments of his life. Charles didn't run this time. He and his brother James personally joined the firefighting lines, passing buckets and directing the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks, soaked and soot-blackened alongside commoners. For a few days, the mask and the man aligned. But the disaster left London financially devastated, mobs lynching foreigners they blamed for the fire, and a crown sinking deeper into debt it could not pay. And it was that debt, that desperate, humiliating shortage of money, that drove Charles to commit what can only be described as treason. On May 22, 1670, at Dover, Charles signed a treaty with King Louis XIV of France. The public version looked like ordinary diplomacy, but hidden inside it was a secret clause so explosive that only a handful of men on Earth knew it existed. In exchange for a private pension of £200,000 a year, an enormous sum worth tens of millions today, enough to let him bypass Parliament's control of his purse. The King of Protestant England had secretly agreed to convert to Catholicism, to publicly announce that conversion when the moment was right, and to back France in war against the Dutch. French troops were even promised to Charles in case his own subjects revolted when the truth came out. Strip away the diplomatic language, and the reality is stark. The King of England put himself on a foreign monarch's payroll and quietly sold his country's religious future for cash. If Parliament had discovered that document, it might not have stopped at taking his crown. This was precisely the kind of betrayal that had cost his father his head, and Charles signed it anyway, then spent the rest of his life making sure no one ever found out. Because here's the thing about that secret clause. The Catholic sympathy wasn't just a bargaining chip. It was real. And Charles would prove it, but not until the very last hours of his life. Publicly, of course, he did the exact opposite. Charles was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and to keep Parliament happy, he signed the Clarendon Code, a series of brutal laws that crushed religious dissenters, ejected around 2,000 ministers from their churches, and filled prisons with Quakers and Puritans. Privately tolerant, publicly repressive, whatever kept the throne safe. His court's reputation, meanwhile, curdled into open scandal. The poet Earl of Rochester famously mocked him as a king who never said a foolish thing, nor ever did a wise one. Charles reportedly just laughed. The smile was armor. It was always armor. When he wasn't performing, Charles retreated to a strange private obsession: science. He founded the Royal Society in 1660 and kept his own private laboratory at Whitehall, where he spent hours conducting chemistry and alchemy experiments, distilling, heating metals, chasing the secrets of matter in a small, unventilated room. It seemed like a harmless royal hobby. Modern science suggests it may have been quietly killing him. Then, in 1678, the reign's ugliest chapter arrived. A disgraced former clergyman named Titus Oates, a man who had been expelled from virtually every school, navy post, and religious order that ever accepted him, invented a story that Catholics were plotting to assassinate the king. The so-called Popish plot was a complete fabrication, and Charles knew it. He personally caught Oates lying under questioning, catching him in basic factual errors. But the country erupted into full anti-Catholic hysteria, and the scumbag fabricator became a national hero. Over the next 3 years, at least 22 innocent men were executed on Oates's perjured testimony. And the king, the one man who could have stopped it, the man secretly taking Catholic gold from France, let them die. Protecting the innocent would have meant defending Catholics in public, and defending Catholics in public meant risking the throne. His father had died for his principles. Charles had decided long ago to have none worth dying for. He drew the line in exactly one place: when the hysteria came for his own Catholic wife. Parliament moved to have Queen Catherine herself accused. Charles refused flatly and shielded the woman he had humiliated for 20 years. Even cynics have one loyalty. By the early 1680s, Charles had outmaneuvered them all. He dissolved Parliament in 1681 and simply never called another one, ruling alone, quietly bankrolled by French money for his final 4 years. The survivor had won. He was 54, seemingly healthy, secure on his throne, master of every secret. He had beaten the axe, the assassins, the plots, and the politicians. He had 4 days left. On the morning of February 2nd, 1685, while being shaved, Charles suddenly cried out and collapsed in a violent convulsion. Rumors of poison began circulating almost instantly. Whispers that his own brother had hurried him into the grave. But modern medical analysis tells a much darker story about the king's own failing body. And what happened next is the part history politely calls his treatment. 14 physicians descended on the dying king, and over the next 4 days, they subjected him to nearly every torment 17th century medicine could devise. They opened his veins and drained him of pints of blood, around 24 ounces in the first sessions alone, with more lettings to follow. They forced emetics and purgatives down his throat and administered enema after enema of antimony, rock salt, and sacred bitters, emptying his body from every direction. They shaved his head and seared his scalp with blistering agents that burned the skin. They applied red-hot cauterizing treatments and plasters of pigeon droppings, and in the desperate final hours, a paste made of pigeon brains was applied to the soles of his feet. They fed him extracts of human skull. Each intervention was recorded, in careful Latin, by his chief physician, Sir Charles Scarborough, which is the only reason the full catalogue survives. Every treatment weakened him further. The man who had survived civil war, exile, a £1,000 bounty, and 14 hours in an oak tree above his hunters was being slowly killed, in his own bed, by the most educated doctors in England. No assassin ever managed to touch Charles II. His healers succeeded where all of them had failed. Through it all, the performer stayed in character to the end. He reportedly apologized to the exhausted men around his bed for being an unconscionable time a-dying, but the dying king had one last secret to settle. And on the evening of February 5th, he finally cashed it in. His brother James cleared the room of Protestant bishops. Then, up a hidden back stairs of Whitehall Palace, a priest was quietly smuggled into the royal bedchamber. It was Father John Huddleston, the same Catholic priest who had hidden the fugitive Charles and bathed his bleeding feet after Worcester 34 years earlier. The man who once saved the king's life had returned to save something else. There, in secret, the supreme governor of the Church of England, the king whose laws had hounded Catholics into prisons, the king who had watched 22 innocent men die rather than defend them, was received into the Catholic Church, confessed, and took his final sacraments as a Catholic. The conversion he had secretly sold to France in 1670 for £200,000 a year, the promise everyone assumed was an empty bargaining chip. He kept it. With almost no breath left, he kept it. His entire 25-year reign as Protestant England's defender had been at its core a performance. The last mask came off only when there was no throne left to lose. Before the end, he also begged James to look after his mistresses, asking that Nell Gwyn, the orange seller who had loved him, never be left to starve. Charles II died at Whitehall Palace just before noon on February 6, 1685, at the age of 54. And modern research delivers the final bitter irony. For centuries, his death was written off as apoplexy, a stroke. But medical retrospectives, revisited extensively by medical historians in recent decades, point instead to uremia, catastrophic kidney failure poisoning his own blood, a diagnosis that matches the convulsions and symptoms Scarberg recorded. And the likely culprit behind those ruined kidneys? Years of inhaling toxic mercury fumes in that little unventilated laboratory at Whitehall. The great survivor. The man who dodged Cromwell's soldiers, foreign assassins, and 3 decades of plots, may well have poisoned himself, one harmless-looking experiment at a time, in the one room where he thought he was safe. He left 14 acknowledged children and not one legal heir. His brother James inherited the throne, ruled openly as a Catholic, and destroyed in 3 years. Everything Charles had spent 25 years protecting, swept away in 1688, the last Stuart king ever to rule with real power. The dynasty Charles had lied, bribed, and betrayed to preserve outlived him by barely 1,000 days. He had sacrificed the truth, the innocent, and his own soul's public face to keep the crown safe. And in the end, the crown wasn't even safe from his own family. Thanks for watching channel. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.